but face to face. We're so glad that you're here. Um, uh, like I said, I'm Michael Hendricks. I'm the Director of State and Local Policy and a Senior Fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. And it's a pleasure to have you here to examine New York City's harm reduction experiment. This is a really important question for the city, for the country. We're talking over 100,000 drug overdose deaths a year across the country. Local governments are on the front lines of tackling this drug crisis. New York City is also very much on the front lines of this crisis, and also very much on the front lines of new experiments, new responses, sometimes controversial in some corners, of tackling this problem. Local governments, but especially here in New York City, they are searching for answers. They're searching for a response. That's why we have this Klinsky Leadership Series program. This is part of a whole series of programs helping to address the biggest crises facing New York City, taking and learning from examples all across the country, case studies all across the country, all across the world, which I think we'll address here today in response to this drug crisis. We're not alone. And the Klinsky Leadership Series helps to provide lessons learned to New York City's leaders, of which we have many of them, but especially we have a whole new crop of them hungry for solutions. And we're here for that. And you, by being here, are part of that response. Now, to moderate this discussion and to introduce the rest of the panel, we have Charles Lehman, my colleague. He's a fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, formerly was at the Washington Free Beacon, has been published everywhere. Currently here at Manhattan Institute, he is predominantly working on our policing public safety initiative. And I know that he could not be more excited to lead this discussion here today. You also, by the way, just between us and everybody else watching online, he's working on this the question that we're going to be discussing today in a new paper. So keep an eye out for that. And with no further ado, Charles Lehman.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a packed room. I was worried that nobody would want to show up to discuss this issue because I sort of tend to think of it as my very parochial interest. But of course, it's an issue of enormous importance. So I'm heartened to see so many people come out today. I hope that we have at least a few viewers online. Welcome to you as well. In November of last year, New York became the first city in the United States to open 2 officially sanctioned supervised consumption sites, facilities where people can use illegal drugs under supervision of trained staff equipped with overdose-reversing medication, who can otherwise get access to services and support. According to OnPoint NYC, the nonprofit that administers the 2 sites, one in East Harlem, one in Washington Heights, they have, over the past 6 months of operation, reversed roughly 314 overdoses. Supervised consumption sites are a matter of public debate. They have a long history of use across Europe, Canada, Australia, a history that we'll talk a little bit about tonight. But Americans have been reticent to embrace them. While some cities have tried to establish them, either formally or informally, New York City is the only one to get there so far. This is in part due to legal hurdles. There's a very active litigation back and forth, dispute over what federal law permits and does not permit. But it's also due to an active debate about their merits, their costs, and their benefits. Advocates argue that they are now more so than ever as the drug overdose crisis reaches historic highs and takes on new form, a necessary life-saving intervention. Opponents question their usefulness and argue that they contribute both to harm in the neighborhoods around them and to encouraging drug use. I also want to sort of situate this in a broader dispute about how America thinks about drug policy in the 21st century in response to, again, an unprecedented drug crisis. Supervised consumption sites are sort of situated in this larger theory of harm reduction. The idea that policy should work to reduce the harms incident to drug use rather than simply trying to discourage it altogether. That's really that's one definition, but harm reduction is really a very contested term as well, as I think we'll get to a little bit tonight. So a lot of ground to cover. Luckily, I have some excellent panelists to cover it with. To my left, Bertha Madras is a professor of psychobiology, which is a real discipline. It's a very cool discipline. A professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School, based in McLean Hospital and cross-pointed at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Her research focuses on neurobiology, imaging, and medication development. including 19 US and 27 international patents for neuropsychiatric disorders. In public policy, she was deputy director for demand reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Drug Czar's office, a presidential appointment confirmed unanimously by the US Senate. To her left, Bryce Pardo is associate director of the Drug Policy Research Center and a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. His work focuses on drug policy with particular interest in the areas of cannabis regulation, opioid control, and new psychoactive substance markets. He's over 10 years of experience working in the national, state, and local government in crime and drug policy. Recently, he's provided congressional testimony about his research on illicit supply of fentanyl to several subcommittees within the U.S. House of Representatives. And finally, at the end, Kaylin C. is the Senior Director of Programs for OnPoint NYC, the entity that administers New York City's supervised consumption sites. Previously, she worked in Vancouver, Canada, developing and operating innovative, award-winning drug-user-focused programs, including the Drug Users Resource Center, which employed 150 active substance users and saw 1,000 member visits a day. Beyond the DURC, she developed Canada's first street-entrenched managed alcohol program and an alcohol exchange for illicit alcohol consumers, a first in the world. Let's welcome our distinguished panelists. So I want to start with Kaylin down at the end. You are a leader in the organization that administers the city's supervised consumption sites. Can you just sort of start by telling us what the past 8 months have been like? What's been the experience on the ground since the site's launched?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's been a whirlwind. It's been chaotic. It's been, I think, overall, off the chart successful in terms of what the projected outcomes were for a site of this kind. The health department, when considering the pilots, initially under the de Blasio administration in 2016, projected that one safe consumption site in New York City would save the lives of 130 New Yorkers in 1 year. Our 2 sites in our first 6 months of operations have actually intervened. The number has changed in 167 overdoses since we opened our doors. Other interesting early outcomes and impacts from the site is they have diverted over 500,000 units of hazardous waste from the parks and public spaces of New York City. It's very difficult to visualize what 500,000 units of hazardous waste looks like. Let me just tell you that it requires several trucks to tow it away. The sites have stabilized the population that we're already, the cohort that we're working with currently, which is already at 1,300 registered drug users between both sites and 24,000 uses of the site so far. This cohort is already showing signs of stabilization, and we're seeing that in a plateau and decrease in overdose occurrence activity, and more interest and readiness for further care, stabilization care, treatment, etc. This is exactly what we intend the sites to do. First and foremost, they're a safety mechanism and a stabilization mechanism for a very niche, very unique population. What's been interesting as well in the neighborhoods where we operate is this perception that there was pushback against the sites when we operated. There was certainly a little bit of pushback in Harlem in particular. I think we've all seen the media from the Greater Harlem Coalition, really focusing on service saturation in East Harlem particularly. Some positive developments in terms of the way the sites are integrating into the neighborhoods where they operate is the Greater Harlem Coalition has officially stated they don't want to be contacted to be the opposition anymore. They said, stop calling us. We don't want to speak against these sites. We misunderstood what they did. We misunderstood their intent, how they work. We now have a very different perspective on the role these sites are intended to play in a continuum of care for a very niche population. And this is true in Washington Heights as well. The last thing I'll say is OnPoint NYC is a part of our strategy to help the American public understand what these sites are supposed to do, have had an open door policy for folks to come in and see the sites. Of course, focusing more on those who misunderstand or perhaps are critical of the sites rather than preaching to the choir. So we've had the Southern District of New York through the sites to see them. They spent 4.5 hours with us. We've had most of the elected officials in the city come through. We've had folks from all over the country, city attorneys, Congress folks, state legislators, all kinds of people from jurisdictions where you would never think this was being considered as a potential intervention. and redress to the opioid epidemic, quietly coming through our sites to say, we've been thinking about doing this. We've been too scared to say, how do these work? What do we do? Because I think everybody acknowledges the status quo is not working, and that we do need to start thinking about these evidence-based tools that previous to us opening the sites in New York, you kind of couldn't talk about in the US without being laughed out of the room. So I think we see that shifting now. We're here. This is an indication of that shift. And we just really hope that, with Biden in power currently, that there'll be a reversal of the crack house statute. Nice full circle moment, leadership moment for Mr. Biden. And that's where we are currently.
Great. Let me, I guess, try to give our audience a little more context. Bryce, you've written a great deal about supervised consumption sites in the international context. What we know about their operation from decades of them operating in other countries. What should our audience know about how New York's and America's experiment with these sites compares to what's going on in other countries? What do we know from the international experience?
So to speak just in general terms, there now are about 130 SCS or supervised consumption sites in over a dozen countries in the world, most in Western Europe and Canada and Australia. I can't speak exactly what's happening on OnPoint because I've never been there, I've never seen it. But there are a couple of things we should keep in mind. The intervention itself has no strict definition. These vary considerably in terms of the services offered. Some places offer a lot more services than others. Some are very rudimentary. Some are point of care. Some are integrated services where you can go and get a lot more treatment options, things like soft tissue treatment, clean needles, naloxone, access to naloxone. Some are basically just there to supervise drug use. So they're quite varied in terms of the definition. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In addition to that, what I can say with regard to the literature on supervised consumption sites and their history, they've been in place in some places for decades, 30 years in some places. They've survived changes of hand and political changes of power, local and national changes of power. The evidence base on supervised consumption sites is fairly large in the peer-reviewed literature, but it is very thin. When you look at the literature base, a lot of them focus on two sites, primarily Insight in Vancouver, and then the MSIC in Sydney. So it's not like we have a lot of information about these sites that can kind of help us decide what's happening here. That said, we did a pretty deep dive into the literature on supervised consumption sites. The individual level outcomes, so things that we care about with regard to individuals, so whether or not an individual is referred to treatment, accesses treatment, whether or not the client reports kind of positive psychosocial outcomes. The literature there is largely positive, but it again is very thin. They'll dichotomize use by frequency of using an SCS, so that could introduce a lot of bias in who's using these services. When we look at the population level outcomes of these studies, and these are a little bit better because there you can actually use natural experiments to kind of say, okay, compared to a control case of a site that doesn't have a neighborhood that doesn't have a supervised consumption site versus one that does, we can kind of see, okay, how we can infer a little bit more about the causal effects here. There, we can see some things about overdose deaths, crime, and discarded injection equipment. So with regard to crime, we do see things like some reports of no changes or slight reductions in crime where a supervised consumption site is facilitated. With overdose deaths, largely no change or slight reduction depending on the study. Again, there's still some confounders that could be driving some of these facts, but so far the studies by and large don't point to any kind of large negative impacts. So there are the two things you want to kind of keep in mind here is that the definitional questions there are definitional questions, and then also the literature by and large kind of points to generally positive or not really much of a negative outcomes associated with these sites.
So what our audience may or may not know if they've been following this debate is that New York managed to get into being the first supervised consumption site in the country. It was almost the second one. There's a major project in Philadelphia, the Safe House Project, which got caught up in the courts, this major litigation into the Trump administration. Kaylin alluded to a law called the Crack House Statute, which may or may not prohibit their operation. There's a lot of legal. The courts have said that they probably prohibit their operation, but this is still a matter of legal dispute. I bring this all up. Bertha, you signed on to an amicus brief in the dispute around Safe House, representing yourself and other former drug control policy officials offering skepticism of supervised consumption sites. What are your thoughts, your concerns about a site like New York's?
Well, I'm not quite familiar with New York's site, but I will say the following in general principles. I think the most important issue that surrounds the controversy is human values. And the values are that catalyze the creation of these sites is to save lives, which no one would dispute. Number two would be to try to reduce HIV and other infectious diseases. Number three is to try to remove some of the detritus that is flooding San Francisco and some of the other cities with regard to discarded needles and a great deal of other waste products. And so, and number four is to prevent withdrawal so that, or try to in certain cases, so that people do not immediately run out and seek another dose. So these are values that are at the heart of creating these sites. And from anybody's humane perspective, they're good values. There is a counter value to that. And that is, what is the ultimate goal of these sites? Is the ultimate goal to save lives and perpetuate drug use? Or is the ultimate goal to try to restore a person back into society and into a meaningful life instead of spending their days nodding off? And I think that that is the secondary part of this that has me concerned, and I would venture to speak for others that it concerns others as well. What is the underlying goal? Simply to perpetuate heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine addiction, and make it safe for the individual? Or is there a different value that we should subscribe to? And I'm on that side.
I think that's actually there are a number of different topics that I want to cover, but that's sort of a good jumping off point to talk about the broader debate about how we think about how policy relates to drug use. Kaylin, I'm interested, I guess, in if you have a response to that, how you think about the questions of values that Bertha is raising, if you think that's the right model. How do you think about that?
I really appreciate the question. And I generally, in broad strokes, agree, which may be a bit of a surprise. Where I think the rubber hits the road with that line of thinking is that the sites are not the silver bullet. We are not going to fix the housing, the very, very broken housing system in not only New York City and other parts of the country. We're not going to redress transgenerational racism, poverty, abuse, trauma. We're not, that the sites aren't going to fix that instantaneously. We're not going to fix the education system. We're not going to fix the criminal justice system or the criminal injustice system, depending on where you sit on that debate. What the sites do, and what they do very well, is they acknowledge that if you don't survive an overdose, you don't have a further opportunity to repair your relationship with your kids, finish your education, get a job, get stable housing. It ends. It's all over. So in terms of the value, if we want to stick with that language and really just sit in the idea of what is a core value, the core value is that every human life is invaluable, and every human being deserves a chance, even if it comes through a very sort of unconventional means, to grasp the brass ring, as it were. Some immediate sort of outcomes or stories from the OnPoint experience is, a gentleman who we've known for many years who has overdosed in our program several times. Who, we saved his life, and he opened his eyes and he said, I'm done. Like, I am done with this. I want to go to treatment. We said, great, absolutely. Called the treatment provider. Treatment provider came and picked him up. He went, he came back. He said, give me a job. We said, great. Yep, absolutely. And we did. If that man had died on the floor of our overdose prevention center, he wouldn't be working our program right now. Another story is, a young man, 21 years old, lost both his parents, fell into addiction, overdosed in our program, almost died, decided he wanted to go to treatment. We called to get him into treatment, and he was declined access to treatment because he'd already been once 6 months earlier, and Medicaid wasn't going to pay for it again. Our site kept him alive until the treatment system caught up to the needs of a youth accessing care. Our sites are not going to fix all of those issues. Our sites serve a very particular function, and it's to acknowledge the value of human life and the value of being able to try again. And there are success stories, and many, many success stories that come out of those sites because of that.
Yeah, and I think this ties into the sort of debate about shifting values in drug policy that I alluded to earlier. Bryce, I want to sort of ask you a question about the course of drug policy, not to take a side on it, but to talk a little bit about, we talked this notion of harm reduction. What can you tell us about sort of the concept? You and Bertha were talking earlier about this. I think there's a lot of debate about what this term means. In the abstract, what can you tell us about sort of what the research base says about this, and what if anything the research base agrees on that term signifying?
Harm reduction.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is traditionally in drug policy, there are two typical pillars that we focus on: demand reduction and supply reduction. Harm reduction is a newer pillar, pragmatic pillar, one that recognizes that individuals may not be ready to stop or can't stop, but we can reduce the harms associated with their drug use and other kind of attendant outcomes. Things that do have cost to society. I mean, paying for someone's HIV treatment for the rest of their lives is more expensive than paying for cleaner syringes. I will say it might be helpful to think about this in kind of a general mathematical abstract term. And I know it's hard without a whiteboard here, but if you look at overdoses or think of overdoses as a function of the population of drug users multiplied by the average harm per dose, or in this case, the kind of a lethal median dose, multiplied then by the intensity of use, so how often they use and the routes of administration that they use. Traditionally, drug policy is focused on reducing the population, the prevalence rates, either through raising the price of illegal drugs sold in streets through supply reduction, or reducing the population by preventing initiation through prevention programs or drug treatment programs that will remove individuals who have a substance use disorder and getting them into treatment so that they stop buying in the market. Harm reduction focuses on those other two factors, the lethality per dose and the intensity of use. I think that's critical in today's day and age, because in a bygone era, maybe we could do enough with supply and demand reduction alone to deal with things like prescription medications and heroin. I mean, of course, limitations to these interventions, but with fentanyl, it's really blowing away all available tools in the tool chest. Harm reduction is just one more thing that we can use to focus on things like increasing transparency in the market so that individuals know that they're coming into contact with fentanyl. Things like fentanyl test strips might be helpful for some folks in these markets. Things like a safer consumption site might be one element in which they can use today to survive to enter treatment tomorrow. So that's kind of the thinking behind harm reduction. And that might be a better way of kind of just visualizing this rather than the kind of traditional levers of supply and just supply and demand. I mean, we can do more with all, but clearly harm reduction can help with this specific area of focus. I should say there are other limitations. Going back to your other question, thinking about it a little bit more. The SCS model, there are two kind of criticisms that I think have not been borne out yet in the research and that still need to be discussed. And those are basically transferability and scalability. Transferability, I mean, can you take essentially what has been done in other countries and apply it here? I mean, we are not Amsterdam, we are not Berlin, we don't have universal healthcare coverage, we have problems with access to housing. Our drug markets are just way more complicated than other countries because of the supply channels, better access to firearms. There are things here that are going to stretch SCS a little bit. In addition to that, the scalability question, thinking about the numbers of individuals or use episodes that get supervised, there are limitations there. And you're running into, how many booths do you have at OnPoint? Maybe a dozen or so, dozen and a half?
Both sites combined, 22.
Okay, 22. And you're serving a population of, you said 1,300, is that right?
Yep.
1,300.
Right now.
And they're using probably what, maybe 6 times a day on average, something like that?
And the sites aren't 24 hours yet, but they
Right.
will be.
So can this be scaled out? In some places, we don't have access to public transportation. So there are other things to consider here. There might be limitations to these interventions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try them. There needs to be research to see, okay, how do they work? How can they be translated? How can they be improved, especially in the context of the United States?
Just need to add that it is an infinitely scalable and adaptable model, right? So there's application for a rural setting, there's virtual supervising, there are all kinds of ways to scale this model. Paris has a beautiful model where their consumption sites are located in a hospital. We have buprenorphine providers who have consumption sites attached to them. There is no limitation to the way we can creatively apply this intervention as a redress to this crisis. So I don't want us to shy away from the thought exercise of scaling this intervention and introducing it to a context where we're losing people at an astronomical rate and causing undue costs to the healthcare system, the policing systems, and the emergency services system. That is the thought exercise the country has got to do. And so I do agree with you, but I think I just want to reframe that a little bit into a positive, that it is scalable and it is adaptable, and that's what makes the intervention so effective, or one of the reasons it can be so effective.
Gosh, I have two different.
Also in housing, safe consumption in a housing setting as well. I can go on and on and on and on. I won't, but I could.
No, I appreciate it. I actually, yeah. Let me come back to Bertha, because I think I want to allude to the point that Bryce made, which I think is a common refrain in current drug policy conversations. In the 1980s, the real problem of drugs was the associated violence. Often the problem of drugs is identified as the health harms rather than the risk to life. But today, the overwhelming problem is drug poisoning. There were something like 10,000 drug overdose deaths in the year 2000. There are something like 100,000 drug overdose deaths today. The basic reason for this is that the drugs have gotten much more potent because of adulteration with synthetic opioids, illicitly manufactured fentanyl, but also other ones. That's a very, very brief summary, very complicated topic. But Bertha, so when you were at ONDCP, you were dealing with, in some senses, the early days of this changing landscape. What do you make of the view that the sort of new normal requires more radical interventions, or more radical, certainly for the American context, interventions? How does that argument sit with you?
Well, it sits at a theoretical level, but not at a practical level. And the reason I say that is that we've been in meetings with people recently on calculating how long it will take to provide enough treatment centers. Now, treatment is the ultimate value goal as far as I'm concerned. Rescue is essential, but treatment has to be part of the trajectory of a person who is using substances that are dangerous. And it would take 10 years to just scale up enough treatment centers in terms of personnel, in terms of training, in terms of complete services that are required. And there are over 22 services that are required to treat an individual at a theoretical level. So the concept that we could scale up supervised injection sites more rapidly than treatment may be valid, but from my perspective, the resistance, the lack of resolve in our country to do much is daunting. And I think it's daunting from every single perspective in terms of drug policy. The one thing that I would conclude about overall drug policy is that we do not have, and we have not had, good administrations that are resolved to really, really tackle this. The other thing that I would conclude is that there's so much emphasis now on patching up the problems that are consequent to fentanyl, which is critical because every human life is precious. I've said that for decades, and I believe that from the bottom of my heart. And every story that can be told of somebody who's rescued, trust me, I have many, many others. because I've been on the ground in many cities throughout my life, listening to people and listening to families. But we're not doing enough about prevention at all. And the harm reduction movement now is moving towards a very different model than what it was even 10 years ago. Because on the one hand, there's one spectrum of harm reduction, which conforms to the idea of saving lives, having clean needles to prevent infectious diseases or infections and so on. On the other hand, there's a spectrum. On the other hand of the spectrum, there are a cohort of very vocal people, including within the medical community, that are saying that drug use has always been a human activity, a human endeavor, and we should just accept it. And we should not move towards abstinence. We should not move towards prevention. We should simply accept use as part of the normal human condition. Now, I come to this area not as a public policy expert, as my colleagues here. I come to this area as basically a neuroscientist. The reason that I was designated a psychobiologist was that somebody pulled that name out of the hat. When I was a very young and intimidated young faculty member and thinking, if they say that's what I should be called, that's good enough. But as a neuroscientist, I've spent a great deal of time studying what drugs do to the brain. And I am not at all comfortable with either initiation or ongoing use, because the consequences at every single level of brain function are so worrisome. And that includes marijuana, includes cocaine, it includes the opioids, the hallucinogens. 60 years ago, I was a graduate student, and the first task I was told by my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, was find out how LSD works. And he handed me 100 vials of human injectable LSD to study. The only criteria he had, which was the most bizarre criteria in retrospect.
Don't take it all at once.
Well,
That's very, you have no idea how many friends asked me for a dose.
I had to.
No, it's appropriate. But his criteria was that since the brain is his domain, I could study LSD in the liver.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't get very far with LSD, but I did get very far in reading the literature from that day forward. And I've read the literature on all these other drugs, plus looked at it with my own bare hands. And I don't think that this is a healthy course that this nation is taking at all. I really think we are in trouble. And the trouble is growing and growing as we normalize use. And we even have medical professionals and scientific professionals who should know better saying that this is a normal human activity. It isn't. It really isn't. We never had the chemistry. We never had marketing. We never had manufacturing processes. We never had isolation and purification of drugs that we have now. We never had pristine cocaine. We never had OxyContin or fentanyl. We never had hallucinogens the way we have them now in the past that were globally accessible at very high concentrations and cheap enough for many people to borrow. This was not the way the world was. Marijuana was introduced in Europe only in the 19th century. They'd never even heard of it. We have now an access that is unprecedented at potencies that are unprecedented in human history, and our nation is sliding into that acceptance and normalization, which is extremely worrisome.
I want to really want to do is ask Helen to respond to that. But before I do that, I'll note that if the audience has any questions, I'll look for those afterwards. If you don't have questions, I have a number of questions about program evaluation I'd like to get into. But I encourage you to ask questions as well. But yeah, Kel, let me come to you on this sort of bigger picture point. And I think Bertha is right that there's a spectrum of views on this. But I think about Carl Hart, who's a professor here in New York at Columbia, who published a widely feted book about the virtues of drug use. And
Terrible.
the virtues of heroin use, and how it's benefited him in his own life. So I guess I want to ask, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to that critique?
Well, birth is a tough one because
That's just because I'm so old.
I agree with some of her framing, as with her previous question, and then I disagree with some of her other framing. I think humankind has sought mind-altering substances in states since time immemorial, and has certainly used psychoactive substances, indigenous communities in particular, all over the world for a very, very long time. And I think if we look at why those indigenous communities in particular use those substances, it's very much what people are seeking today. But as you really you sort of unpacked so well, so very, very, very broken and dangerous world. So to me, substance use and the rate of addiction in this country is directly tied to other systemic factors. And we're not going to get out of this mess unless we're willing to broaden our sort of perception of what is causing the problem. It is more complicated, but it's not just about the drugs. And that's sort of a foundational philosophical tenet that harm reduction really holds to, is that the drugs actually have very little to do with why we're in the situation that we're in. It's a lot of societal factors, long-standing, deeply entrenched, broken societal factors that are really fueling this in big part. But I agree. I think we share a lot more common ground than you would think if you look at our bios on paper. Certainly know when I saw you were on this panel, Bertha, I was like, oh shit. But the abstinence community, right? The abstinence community and the harm reduction community are not at ills. They're partners in this fight. They work very, very well together. But you're not going to like this, but abstinence fails every single time until the one time it doesn't. And that's really the role of harm reduction, to come in, scoop those people up, keep them alive so they can try again. And incidentally, of the 1,300 people that are currently using the overdose prevention programs at both of our sites, every single one of them, every single one, without exception, has been to treatment, been through detoxification services, been on methadone, and been on buprenorphine many, many times. This is something you work at for years. And we're not talking about people who, are sort of experimenting with drugs. I agree with you about prevention. I agree with you about treatment. The treatment system in this country is really deeply, deeply flawed, and needs a massive overhaul. But it's a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue. That's all I'll say. I feel like you want to jump in on this. The pen is going.
Bryce, if you have something to add, I know Bertha had one thing to add, and then I'll take questions from the audience.
So I definitely agree that we have a culture of excess, and it is only getting worse because we are outsmarting ourselves. The ability with which we can produce chemicals with greater speed, with greater potency is unprecedented. That is true. But to Caitlin's point as well, I mean, if you, and to contrast with Bertha's point, I think if you also enjoy your wine and beer, by the way, if you think about how these individuals are, what they're doing and how they're doing it, it does make sense, because they are often trying to escape some sort of pain, physical or emotional trauma. In some other cases, they are, they have an addiction. So they're essentially, they're doing this because they're trying to avoid withdrawal, which is extremely painful. SCS are not designed for the high school kid who wants to experiment. These are for people who have, been in and out of methadone, who have it's not worked for them and they're still using. So it's just one way to keep them alive today so that they can hopefully go to treatment tomorrow, because you can't enter treatment if you're dead. So that's the idea here. SCS, using illegal drugs is not a good end state. It's not an end in and of itself. It's really kind of a means to an end, which is eventually treatment referral and treatment entrance, and then eventually successful exit out of treatment into recovery. So that's the kind of thing that this can be blended with other demand reduction programs very successfully.
Bertha, did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to add one very ill-defined fact that has tremendous amount of research data behind it, and that is multi-generational drug use. We know with a higher and higher level of certainty that if parents use and normalize drugs at home, their children are going to use. And the use rates for opioids, for marijuana, for cocaine, all of these things just shoot up in the next generation and the next. One of the big problems is that the use of these drugs could also confer epigenetic changes in the germ cells of the parents, the father or the mother, so that the children that are born, even if the parents don't use during conception, the children that are born may have a predisposition to appreciating heroin at higher levels. I mean, certainly there's a good data that's being done even in New York by Yasmin Hurd at Mount Sinai on this, on multi-generational epigenetic changes. So if we don't stop the pipeline, we're never going to end this problem. How many in this audience know how many analogs of fentanyl are feasible? How many would say 10? 100? Just raise your hand. Don't be. Do you think there are more than 100 fentanyl analogs possible? Yeah, there are over 1,000. And if we get rid of fentanyl, we'll have acetyl fentanyl, carfentanil, and hundreds and hundreds down the pipe. It will never end until we begin to develop a culture that begins to look on drugs as a malevolent and maladaptive problem rather than something that is normal in humans seeking outlets.
I want to keep this conversation going, but I also want to see if there are any questions from our audience. I will point to the gentleman in the front, whose name I think is Thomas. I can read his name tag from here. I can't read everyone's name tag from here, so I apologize.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. I wanted to address this to the fellow from RAND. You described a function of the population, the death rate, and the use variables to create a model of how these these harm reduction centers would fit in. It seems like Bertha was describing how the population would increase, although even if you're bringing down the lethality. Is that something you see in the literature? Is that something that concerns you?
So with anything, there are trade-offs here, and it depends on the drug in question. With regard to SCS, we're largely focusing on overdoses from opioids, though other things can be used here. Methamphetamine is often used in some of these services. If you look at total harm, which is on the left-hand side, in this case, overdoses, is a function of 3 factors: prevalence times intensity of use times average harm per dose. Those are the 3 things you kind of want to focus on to reduce total harm. Now, yes, there could be trade-offs. You legalize alcohol, you may increase population that uses alcohol, but you've reduced the harmfulness of what's being used because you don't have adulterants, you don't have bathtub gin. So there's a trade-off here. With SCS, we have not seen in the literature so far of these things encouraging greater use or more people being attracted to them. Because again, these are serving a population that's already kind of at the end of their rope. These are folks who are kind of failing out of treatment, can access treatment. They're not new users. They're not like these are often very clinical places to go. This is not a fun place. It's not like a bar. This is not like a rave. You go in there, you sit in a booth. It's very medicalized in many cases.
I would just add to that, that we do have an early sort of example. The folks that we've enrolled at the site in New York are exactly as described. These aren't people we don't know. Even in 6 months of operation with the entire city of drug users knowing where our 2 sites are, there has been no broad recruitment from any other jurisdiction. These are existing participants of the 2 programs in the 2 spaces where we operate. even after 6 months.
In many cases, they're registered. That's the thing. They're a known population.
In the back, yeah.
Hey, thanks everyone. From what I'm hearing, OnPoint has a very specific solution to a very specific problem. Feels tangible. I'm not understanding what the proposal is to adjust the pipeline issues or the cultural issues, or how we would go about doing that in general, or what kinds of solutions would be there. If anyone would like to speak to that.
Bertha?
Well, let's take a look at prevention. There has been very little from the White House down for a number of years on promoting prevention amongst youth. There is very little effort. In fact, the movement is in the opposite direction, with ballot initiatives in Oregon, in California, in many states. There's a movement towards, and I predicted this 10 years ago, once we decriminalized and legalized marijuana, the next one would be hallucinogens. First we would medicalize, then we would legalize. And I think that that is essentially the way the country is going. The concept of prevention, the concept of saying that this is not a way to solve inner human torment. It's not a way to solve demons. It's not a way to solve challenges that people face in life. And every one of you in this room, and including every one of us in this panel, has had burdens and challenges in our lives, some of which seem very daunting. And we simply are not presenting the message to our population that drugs do not solve those problems. They exacerbate them. They derail potential, they derail educational opportunities, and they derail the capacity to really begin to turn your life around. Because they are, in fact, as Arthur Kessler called it, a confidence trick, played on your mind to think that you're feeling good, when in fact things are really not good.
If I could, a little bit, just to extend on that, I think prevention is important. I don't think anybody would be against prevention in the right mind. The benefits to prevention, though, the return on investment is long term. You're talking about teaching kids today not to initiate. The problem we're having today is an overdose crisis driven by the supply in these markets that is irredeemably it's toxic. So addressing that is going to require things like harm reduction, in some instances, supply reduction, targeted supply reduction. But prevention, it's all well and good, but you're talking about long-term payouts here. So kind of balancing those needs are important.
Yeah. I'd just like to add, if we look at the opioid crisis and what catalyzed it, and I've done a great deal of in-depth research on this, it was prescription opioids. Yep. And it was a 3 to 4-fold increase in prescribing for any indication of pain, chronic pain, without any evidence base that they work. And it was catalyzed by vast amounts of money, by the pharmaceutical industry, by literally giving donations, and I know I can name each of those donations if you'd like, giving donations to medical associations, to the Federation of State Medical Boards, to the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, and Press Ganey scores. I can go on and on. All these things, there are 32 root causes that I have identified, which one of these days I will write up in a paper if I had the time, that catalyzed. And what we had was a nation awash with opioids that were not being used, and so they were gradually filtering out from prescriptions into the rest of the community. The heroin producers, the cartels, realized they've got an opportunity. Their price point went down, their purity went up. They stepped in 2010, and then fentanyl stepped in 2013, and we had a disaster. So just the concept of normalizing the use of prescription opioids as non-addictive and safe medically is what created this. Now, would fentanyl have come along independently of this?
Oh, yeah.
It had come along in the past. There was a super lab in Toluca in 2005 that was producing quantities of fentanyl. I was in office at that time, and when we had 1,000 overdose deaths in 1 year due to fentanyl, 1,000, we have 107,000 now. We had 1,000, I panicked. And I called the drug czar while he was on the road, and I said, we have to do something. This is the most unacceptable thing. And we had a fentanyl forum, and the super lab was taken out in Mexico, and the problem disappeared. We were down to just single double digits of deaths after that. Supply did work.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna, if Michael, if you want to ask a question. There's the people behind me, but yeah, here, no, please. I think yeah.
How does the type of drug change your discussion at all? So you've talked a lot about opioids. When you think of other drugs, perhaps methamphetamine, does it change how you think about the site, how you think about the impact on the rest of the community, on the user, on the surrounding neighbors? How does the type of drug affect this discussion, if at all?
You should answer that.
There is a heightened possibility of loss of life with the use of opioids or other depressants or combining depressants, absolutely. But the impact on the person can be really severe no matter the substance. At our 2 sites, of the 350-ish in there overdoses we've had, 84 were stimulant overdoses. So cardiac arrest, stroke, seizure, extreme events of mood and mind, psychosis, delusion, etc. Loss of an ability to self-regulate the body and the bodily systems. Very difficult to manage from a programmatic perspective. You know, opiate users are very docile. It's a nice little nod. A stimulant overdose is chaotic, can be dangerous. So just jumping in a little bit on what Bertha was saying, the drug supply has been changing for as long as drugs have been an issue in the US. You know, I called to mind K2, the introduction of K2 was a change in the drug supply. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s, change in the drug supply. The pharmaceuticals saturating the market with prescription opioids, change in the drug supply. The drug dealing response by producing synthetic analogs, change in the drug supply. The drugs will continue to change. Again, going back to an earlier point, it's not about the drugs. The drugs are always going to change. They're going to keep changing. Xylazine is in the drug supply. Carfentanil is coming. Levamisole is in the drug supply. It's going to continue to change and have detrimental effects on the people that are using the drugs. It's a complicated societal issue that is not the responsibility of just harm reduction to solve. However, we want to stake in the game because we know the interventions are cheap to implement and they work. At our sites in particular, you can use any substance you want in our 2 sites. That's a unique feature of the sites, as I'm sure you know. Not every site in other parts of the world. Sometimes you can only use heroin. The Norway model, you can only use heroin. Some are just heroin and cocaine. You can use whatever you want when you come into our sites in whatever quantity you want.
Route of administration?
Pardon?
Route of administration?
Any mode of administration you want. You can smoke, snort, inject, swallow, whatever. By removing those strictures, we ensure that we will capture the entire instance of use, keep that out of the public sphere, and deal with any medical emergency that occurs in our site without involving emergency services, the hospital system, or police. So I don't know. I don't want to totally marginalize myself and have you all sort of like your eyes glaze over and just say, well, she's a wingnut. But one of the cases for legalization, legalizing and regulating the drug supply is definitely about cleaning up the adulterated drug supply. It's also could make economic sense for the US, It also is a national security issue. If we are controlling what's coming in and out of this country, if we take control of the drug supply, we have a real impact on what is happening on the streets with people who are ingesting drugs. Yes, treatment. Yes, prevention. Yes, education. Yes, fixing housing, all of the things. But really getting a handle on the drug supply is going to be a big part of this as well.
I'm gonna, I think we're basically at time. There's so much more that we can talk about here. I'm gonna encourage everyone to stick around. I don't actually know if we can stick around. Maybe we can stick around. So I encourage everyone to continue the conversation. Everyone, please thank our panelists so much for all of their thoughtful commentary this evening. And thank you all so much for coming.
We still take questions.
I'm gonna excuse myself. One moment. Sorry, we're just running up against time.